Hi, this is Barry, and welcome to the next episode of the Simplicity Zen podcast. Today, my guest is longtime Zen practitioner Barbara O'Brien, who is the author of a fabulous book titled The Circle of the Way, A Concise History of Zen from the Buddha to the Modern World, published by Shambhala. For the longest time, the only thorough history of Zen Buddhism written for a general audience was a book titled A History of Zen Buddhism by Henrik Dumoulin. I think I'm pronouncing that correct. It's an excellent book, but was largely written before modern-day scholarship that calls a lot of the traditional Zen narrative into question. By contrast, Barbara's book is very up-to-date on modern scholarship and offers a fresh and authentic look at the reality of Zen's history. How are you doing today, Barbara?
Okay,
Thanks so much for joining us.
good to be here.
Could you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what your childhood was like, as far as
Well,
family
I
situation
go
and so
back that far. Look, I am an old lady, so this is a long story, but I am an Ozark Mountain girl. I grew up in rural Missouri,
Uh-huh.
and if we want to talk about, so let's skip a few decades.
Okay.
And so in 1980 or so, I was married and had a baby and living in Cincinnati.
Uh-huh.
And I joined a Unitarian fellowship there. And the minister at the time, he was a temporary, but fellow had studied Zen. I don't know if he was ever a regular student, but he had spent quite a bit of time at the San Francisco Zen Center.
Okay.
And so a lot of his talks were centered on Zen teachings, which were brand new to me. And also at one point he gave us a workshop in how to sit Zazen, which was my first lesson in how to sit, and which was nice. It was out in a state park, and at one point while I was sitting there, a very large black rat snake crawled out from under a rock, and we were all so mellow, nobody yelled about it. I don't get upset at black rat snakes because I know they're not toxic. I'm a dark mountain girl, and so I am used to snakes. But it was very large. Anyway, so then we skip a few years. Let's go maybe 5 years later, 6 years. I was living in New Jersey, and I had 2 children, and was getting a divorce, and was very, going through a rough patch in my life. And I saw this would have been about 1987, actually, thinking about it. I saw an ad or newspaper notice for a meditation workshop in Manhattan on Zen meditation. And I was thinking, that might be just the thing. And so I went, and it was being led by John Dido Luri of Zen Mountain Monastery. And so I was just so impressed with him that I went to the monastery and did a couple of weekend retreats, and then became a student, went through the steps of formally becoming a student in 1988.
Yeah, that was not too long after he established it in the mid 80s or the early 80s. Do you remember?
I would have been early 80s.
Yeah, so he was fairly well established at that point then.
Well, yeah, the place already had some history by the time I went there. That's all I remember.
So
yes, go ahead.
Going back a little bit, so did you grow up with any religious beliefs?
We were very Lutheran. I mean, I grew up in the Bible Belt, but being Lutheran was a bit odd because around here everybody's a Pentecostal or an evangelical. But I had a certain amount of I know my people. It was a challenge. It's a challenging place to grow up, since I was sprinkled instead of dunked. If you grow up in the Bible Belt, almost everyone is born again. You went through full body immersion baptism, but I was not. I was baptized as an infant, and so I was sprinkled. And if you're sprinkled instead of dunked, you're not born again, and you're not really the right kind of Christian. And so it was kind of challenging. But I don't. I look at back of this with some amusement at this point, but yeah, the Bible Belt, it's a challenge. But I had kind of become unchurched in college.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really believe it anymore, you know.
Uh-huh.
And I'd had a moment when I had been going to the campus Lutheran Church. I went to University of Missouri, Columbia, and at one point I was just listening to people talk, and I realized that in order to go along with all this, you had to accept a parameters of belief.
Mm-hmm.
You have to accept that, and otherwise it all fell apart. And I remember sitting there thinking that I would really like to find some kind of religious or spiritual path that did not require some kind of parameters of belief.
Mm-hmm.
And so I looked back at me and said, okay, this was the first step. I didn't know it. That's Zen pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
But it was really my formal training really got going in 1988, I would say. So up at Zen Mountain Monastery. Although that was kind of a challenge because I was living in New Jersey. It was like a 2-3 hour drive for me, and I was raising 2 kids by myself and working full time. It was hard. It was very hard, but somehow I stuck to it for many years.
Uh-huh.
So
did you maintain a sitting practice? So you discovered Zazen at the Unitarian Church, and then years later you crossed paths with John Dido, Lori, Roshi. Did you practice in between that? Did you maintain a sitting practice?
A little bit,
Uh-huh.
not steady.
Uh-huh.
But and it was hard even after I became a student. I remember my at-home practice consisted mostly of after I put the kids to bed and picked up all the Legos out of the carpet and the Barbie doll shoes. Barbie doll shoes are deadly. I want you to know that.
I've experienced that the hard way.
And finally throwing a couple of throw pillows. I didn't have a proper zafu on the floor, and came to sit for 5 minutes and not fall asleep. And that was about all I could manage. And at the time I thought, this is ridiculous, but somehow I stuck to it. But I think that looking back on it later, although it didn't seem like much at the time, I think it was enough for me at the time. Consistency is the important thing, I think.
Had you encountered any Buddhist teachings prior to the Universal Church? Like, had you read any books about Buddhism or Eastern spirituality?
I honestly had never really been exposed to Buddhism at all before then.
Interesting. So your first experience of it was experiential as opposed to conceptual then?
I would say so. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think can be powerful.
Yeah, well, I think that it was good not to have any fixed ideas about it. I really had no opinion or ideas at all about Buddhism, and that's an advantage, I think. So I walked into it having no idea what this was, and somehow it just clicked with me. I think that the first time I went to a retreat at Zen Mountain Monastery, it just felt like home to me. It's hard to explain. And I remember after I'd been there for a couple of years, I went to a retreat, and Jan Chosen Bays, who was Dido's Dharma sister, was leading a retreat, and she gave a talk on the Four Noble Truths. And this had been lectured at me a few times before. So the way she presented it, I suddenly went, oh, and that's what this Buddhism thing is.
She was out there visiting.
Yeah, she was visiting, and that was a step, because it was at that retreat that I really, up until that point, I wasn't sure about this Buddhism thing, but I liked the sit zazen. But that was really the beginning for me of being keenly interested in Buddhism itself.
What was your early impression of John Dido Laurie? Was he warm? Was he austere? All the above? Was
Oh my goodness, he was a bit intimidating to
uh-huh.
me. Um, what was my original? Mm. Yeah, I would say intimidating. I wasn't sure what to make of him. He
Uh-huh.
didn't. He didn't fit any of my predetermined ideas about what a spiritual leader ought to be. He
Hmm.
had tattoos, for example.
Hmm.
This is, what seemed odd to me, but that's a good thing too. And he was always very. Now he could be rough to some people, but he
Hmm.
was always very supportive and kind, I would say, to me, because he probably realized that I beat myself up enough. He didn't have to do it for me.
Right. Yeah,
So yeah,
I've heard stories of people being shocked to see him smoking cigarettes in the Dokusan room.
yeah, he did smoke like a chimney, which is what killed him eventually.
Yeah, that's too bad. It did. What for when you were just going through the phase of just sitting, something was pulling you back. Do you think you were seeing a change in your life or your perspective on life, or maybe some stress
Um,
reduction? Like what was kind of drawing you back prior to the Jan Chozen Bay's kind of epiphany?
well, it's hard to explain. I had, after my second baby, I'd had extreme postpartum depression that
Hmm.
lingered for a long time. I was still actually dealing with a low level of depression for years and years, even when I was a Zen student.
Hmm.
A lot of what I wanted from it in the beginning was the concentration practice I had hoped would help me deal with the depression, because part of that is that it's really hard to focus on anything at all
Hmm.
at that when you're with that particular problem.
Hmm.
And they hadn't invented the really good antidepressants yet, so I was trying to tough it out on my own.
Hmm.
And so that was, and it did help a little, although eventually I finally did do the antidepressants, and that cured me finally, and I'm not doing them anymore.
Hmm.
But what I think it gave me some grounding, some direction to just sort of hang on to being functional even at the
Hmm.
beginning.
Hmm.
Um, so it's really hard to explain. And this is a long time ago, and I'm trying to remember what was I doing then.
Right.
Sometimes it's hard to reconstruct where you were after several years.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are during these interviews revisit stuff they literally haven't thought about since those times. I've
Yeah,
noticed. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, so you eventually developed a deep scholarly interest in Buddhism. Were you reading at the time, or was it mostly just you're busy with life and practicing and not so
Well,
much reading too much?
I'm not really a very disciplined studier.
Hmm.
And I did read, in the beginning, I did read a lot of various books, all the ones that everybody else reads, like Three Pillars of Zen and Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and the whole list. They're all the ones we all read.
Hmm.
Um, what really got me going, well, was probably, well, a few other things happened. I was a student at Zen Mountain Monastery through most of the 90s, but at some point it just got to be too hard to try
Hmm.
to get up there.
Hmm.
With my life. And so I kind of drifted away from it for a little while, although I didn't give up on Zen. I just felt that, I needed easier Zen somehow.
Yeah.
And so after a bit, I moved to New York and Westchester County, New York. And in time, I found that there was a Zen center in New Rochelle. And so I went there, and that's when I met my next teacher, who was Susan Postal, Geon Susan Postal, if we use
I
it.
actually am not familiar with her. Is she
She's,
what lineage
she,
was she in?
yeah, well, she's had a varied background, but she had been a student of Maureen Milon Stewart for a
Oh,
while.
okay. Hmm.
But she didn't receive transmission from Maureen. When Maureen died, and I'm not sure, that was early 1990s, I think. I'm not sure what year that was. when she died, she had not given transmission to Susan, but she had told Susan, you should go ahead and teach. You're ready to teach, you go ahead and teach. And so she started that, but of course she hadn't received transmission, so that's a problem. So then she found a teacher out of the San Francisco Zen Center group. What was her name? Darlene
Cohen?
Darlene Cohen, yes.
Okay.
She received transmission from Darlene Cohen. And it was at the time that I started going there, this hadn't happened yet, but she was working with Darlene. And when I went to, and this was like a short drive from where I was, and so I really it was a great thing for me because I really threw myself into the community there. And not too much longer later, I moved so that I was only about less than a mile from the Zen Center, so I could go in for morning Zazen every day. And so this, in a lot of ways, was my best time as a Zen student because it was a small community, and you could see Susan all the time. She was very accessible. It was great, It was, whereas Dido had always seemed a bit remote. He was a great teacher in a lot of ways. He gave great Dharma talks. I still hear his Dharma talks in my head sometimes. But he was a bit remote. But Susan was just right there. And she was great for me because she was supportive, but she also called me out of my bullshit when necessary, which was often. And that was a great time for practice for me. And it was also in about 2008 when I got hired by the About.com website. Which was
About what? I'm sorry?
About.com.
Okay.
Do you remember them?
Yes.
Okay. So at the time it was owned by the New York Times Company, and they were looking for a new person to write their Buddhism section. So I said, oh, okay, I can do that. I know a lot about Buddhism. So I applied for it, and they actually hired me. This was a freelance kind of thing. I was on contract with them. I didn't go in and work in an office, but I worked for them on contract.
Had you already worked as a writer at that point? Did you have a career as you're raising children, or what?
Well, I've been an editor. I got my bachelor's degree was in journalism, and I wrote things on and off, but most of my career was as an editor and also in production, which is I was in book publishing. I was one of the people who pulled together all the elements of the book to see to it that it got printed and bound. So it was kind of more managing at that most of the time. But this was sheer writing, and I got really into it. And after and I worked for them for several years, and so after a while, it was an interesting thing because they didn't edit anything I wrote. They didn't even look at it. I would just write something and put it on their website. I could have been writing complete nonsense, and I don't think they would have known. But I really tried my best with it. And after getting through the first, the basics of what everybody does, like the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, I had to start doing research. I had to start learning more stuff to write about because I had a quota. I had to write so much stuff every month. So I was applying myself, and also in doing all this stuff, I began to put together in my head that there were all these teachings that actually did apply to Zen, but that I'd never really been systematically taught at any point. Because they don't do that in Zen. You show up at the center and they teach you how to sit and meditate, and you listen to a taisho about a koan usually, or something that Dogen wrote, and nobody ever sits you down and say, okay, here, when we say this comes from Yogacara teachings, or comes from Nagarjuna's Majamata work and all that. Nobody ever does that. And so I was, for the first time, I was like putting it all together where all this stuff came from. And so that was useful. But yes. And then, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I want to get back to this, but going back to your first two teachers, what type of practicing were you doing? Did Dido start you on breath counting, and then work
Yeah,
in
Diner
koan?
was good. Yeah, he did breath counting for a long, long time. He did get me started on koan work, but I did not exactly blaze a trail of light in the sky with it. I
Hmm.
didn't get very far with it. You
Hmm.
see, I hardly ever saw him. The thing with koans, if you're not with it, able to see a teacher frequently, it's really hard,
Yes, definitely.
you know.
It's kind of the point in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's really a way of working with the teacher. I mean, that's the whole point of it. And if you're only going to see a teacher maybe 4 times a year when you go to retreat, it really is difficult to do it. And so, of course, Susan was purely shikantaza, and that worked better for me anyway.
Mhm.
But uh,
And
yeah.
did you how frequently would you get to see her in Dokusan?
Oh, not every week, but
Hmm.
a couple of times a month.
Hmm. And was it kind of like living room Zen where it was in someone's house, or was it a standalone center?
There was a regular Zen center. It's a really nice little building right in the middle of New Rochelle. It used to be, it's kind of a historic structure. At one time, it held trolley cars
Hmm.
there. And so they had turned it into a nice Zendo with a library. And then upstairs was an apartment for the teacher with a kitchen.
Hmm.
And it's still there. I mean, I'm speaking of it in the past tense. I haven't been there for a while now, but it's still there.
Hmm.
A lovely place. So we had and the Zen community owned it.
And she was a
So
priest, right? A full priest.
yeah, she had been ordained as a priest, and then also she received transmission. Oh gosh, I missed the transmission ceremony because I had the flu.
Okay. Sorry, you
Would
broke
have
up
been
there for a
about
second. Could you say that
2010.
again? Your audio died out for a second.
Oh, I said I missed the transmission. I missed her transmission ceremony because I had the flu. So I can't. But I'm trying to remember. But
Oh.
yeah, she did have transmission. So she was
And,
an official teacher.
and was she a full-time teacher? Did she work as
Oh
well,
yeah,
or was she supported by the Sangha?
she was supported by the Sangha, so she was full time.
Hmm.
So
Is she still among us? She's still with
no,
us? She
well
passed
that
away.
yeah, she died in 2015
Okay.
of cancer, and so that was my next big move. I had my only sibling, um, my older brother, also died of cancer in December of 2014, and then Susan died, I think, in February 2015. And this was kind of a double whammy to me in a lot of
Yeah,
ways.
yeah, I can imagine.
And so I decided to do something bold, and I gave away most of my stuff
Hmm.
or sold it and put what was left in a storage locker in Brooklyn. And I moved into did a year's residency at the Fire Lotus Temple in Brooklyn, which is affiliated with Zen Mountain Monastery. So I was back with White Plum again.
And
Uh,
who was the teacher there?
it varied. We
Okay.
didn't have anyone living there. We had visiting people would come down from Zen Mountain Monastery. It was kind of an odd arrangement
Hmm.
because there was a lot of upheaval at ZMM at the time. But Jeffrey Shugan Arnold, whom I had known when he was a junior monk years before, is
Hmm.
now, of course, the abbot. And he's a
Hmm.
sweet guy. You know, he's sweet as he can be and very sincere. Um, but he only would come down occasionally, and we'd have various monastics come down and babysit us
Hmm.
most of the time. But it was a good thing because there was morning zazen, and I was the breakfast cook, and people got oatmeal whether they wanted it or not. And so it was a good year. But I was there for a year.
What? How did that change the texture or experience of your practice? Actually,
I
doing
think it
monastic residential.
I think it was good. It certainly deepened my practice quite a bit. And even though there was less face, I missed the face to face with Susan that I was accustomed to. There was actually less of that
Mm-hmm.
at Fire Lotus, but still, there was good fellowship and good people,
Mm-hmm.
and I would have happily stayed there for quite a long time, except for one thing, which is that I'm old,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a 4-story building with no elevator.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a point in one's life that you have to look at yourself and say, damn, I am going to pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And the building itself didn't do my degenerative arthritis any good. And after I left, I had to start walking with a cane because my knees were shot.
Mm-hmm.
But that's me complaining. But there are some things that you just can't do after a while, and that
Right.
was one of them.
Uh-huh.
And then it was shortly after I left there that the about.com people canceled all of our contracts, not all of our contracts, but most of our contracts.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, I had no income, and I ended up moving back to the Ozarks to stay with family so that I could live.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's where I still am, actually.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure I've seen articles about yours. Is it Tricycle or Shambhala? Where have I seen your articles?
I've written for Tricycle,
Uh-huh.
and I wrote something for Lions Roar.
Mm-hmm. How did you get connected with them?
They called me, actually, as I remember.
Uh-huh.
You know, I was I don't remember. I'm writing something now for somebody. I'm not going to say who, because if they decide they don't like what I write, then they publish it, and then I'll feel stupid. But
Mm-hmm.
you know, they call me.
Mm-hmm.
I say, "Oh, would you write a little thing for us?" And oh, okay, I can do that. So
Yeah, you're obviously a talented writer. Is that something you just picked up naturally, or did that come from school? How did you get that skill?
I have a degree in journalism, so I do write.
I see. Mm-hmm.
But I'm a word person. I love
Mm-hmm.
words. I love the language.
Mm-hmm.
And so writing is just what I do.
Mm-hmm.
Don't ask me to do math, though.
Right. So how did the idea of Circle of Zen come about?
Well, it was about the time it was actually really while I was still at Fire Lotus, because, as you said, somebody came and I put this in the book, that somebody came into the library there and wanted a history of Zen. And we have the Dumoulin, which is a 2-volume thing. It's huge.
Mm-hmm.
That I had used for a reference book for a while, but I had never been able to sit down and read the thing all the way through, because it's like too much, you know, it goes on and on. And I said, well, here, this is all there is, you know. And I remember thinking, you know, somebody ought to write something more concise.
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought, hey, I could do that.
Mm-hmm.
So so late in 2016, I had become sort of distantly acquainted with an editor at Shambhala through social media. And I sent him a proposal, and he looked at it and presented it to the staff there and said, okay, we're going to publish it. And I got the contract then in 2016 and spent the next few years pretty much working on Circle of the Way.
So you got the contract before writing much or any of it then?
Right. I had written one sample chapter, then I ended up rewriting and an outline, and that's all I've done.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about the research period? You know, how that went, what your sources were,
Oh my gosh.
what insights you had?
Well, yes. For the most part, I didn't want to write just the same old stories that we all know. I was trying to write something that was an honest history, and trying to separate. By then, I'd already done enough research working on my about.com site that I had stumbled into a lot of stuff that the stories that we'd heard in Zen Center, and that the history that was being written by the academic people, and were two different stories. They were not matching up. And so I wanted to try to reconcile this as much as I could. So I also made the decision that I wanted to try to anchor the stories about Zen within the larger context of world history, and not just treat it as if it were a separate thing that happened in a little vacuum. The rest of the world didn't touch. So that meant I had to read all kinds of books. I spent some time with a history of India and histories of China and histories of Japan, and I dug out a whole bunch of academic books that I would never have looked at otherwise, and try to see, what is the current research, what has been written about this particular period of Buddhist history by somebody, and what can it teach us. And so I ended up, I don't even know how many sources I had. It's all in the footnotes anyway, so you can look.
Yeah.
But it was just really a work of discovery, because I started out knowing a little bit and then got going on it. And the more I dug, oh my gosh, the more I learned. So that was, it was quite absorbing, shall we say.
And so one thing I find interesting about Zen is, so I have, for whatever reason, I've accumulated a number of ex-Mormon friends over the years. And their journey away from Mormonism all kind of are similar in the sense that, they grew up with a mythology around Mormonism. And then they were introduced, to material that called into question the historical reality of the reality that's presented by the Mormon scriptures. And that would cause and they just couldn't reconcile that, and that would cause a crisis of faith. And they'd leave Mormonism because, if the traditional history is not real, our faith has no basis, so it can't be true. Whereas with Zen, is it, how do you pronounce it? Duanhang caves? I'm mangling it horribly.
Okay.
The caves where they discovered all those writings that contradict. We'll call it Duanhang. That's probably pronounced it wrong.
Your guess is as good as mine, frankly.
A lot of these words I've just read hundreds of times, but actually never said. So I never realized that until I try saying it. I'm like, oh wait, I actually don't know how this is pronounced.
Yes, but, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. Well, anyways, a lot of the material discovered in those caves, frankly, blatantly contradicts a lot of Zen history. For example, there's a pretty good chance that the second and third, or I guess would be the third and fourth patriarchs, never actually met. The fourth patriarch.
The third patriarch was a patch.
Yeah. And a huge portion of Hunang's history is just pure mythology. What so literally shows the mythology of Zen that we've kind of grown up with just to be not true. And what I find interesting is that instead of like causing a crisis of faith, it really doesn't bother me, and that seems to, because with Zen, it's all based on your personal experience, it's not predicated on the mythology being historically real, because we have to discover it for ourselves. Do you share that experience? And if so, could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Okay. Yeah, I know what you mean. In some ways, for example, we've all heard the stories, but so we learned the story about how, for example, Huike, second patriarch, cut off his arm to get Bodhidharma's attention. Well, you read that story because, yeah, right. You don't really see somebody having a sensible conversation just after he's cut off his own arm. But, the original story that you run into the older text is that he lost his arm in a encounter with bandits. The cave story, I think, was invented sometime during the Tang Dynasty. And then there's another school of thought presented by one academic guy who's a real obnoxious jerk, but he's probably right about some things, that said that Huike probably was perfectly sound, and that the cutting off his arm story was just hagiography. Well, but does it matter? Well, no, not really. We can appreciate the story of poor old Huike cutting off his arm and standing in the snow and trying to get Bodhidharma's attention as a myth, because if you appreciate myths in the Joseph Campbell sense as stories that are not literally true but still can provide some sort of guidance on a deep level, because there are times maybe we've all been Bodhidharma, standing in the snow and wanting to cut off our arm and trying to get someone to tell us what to do. And on that level, it's a perfectly fine story. We just don't want to confuse it with any actual history. We don't know, as I wrote in the book, we can't really prove that there even was such a person as Bodhidharma. It was interesting to me because I'd never really given much thought to the second patriarch, good old Huike, or Taiso Eka in Japanese, that he actually must have been a really very important teacher in his day. He lived from 487 to 593, and decades after he had died, they were still compiling. The historians of the period were compiling details of his life and writing about him. He was apparently very famous and highly renowned. And I realized that the only reason that we've ever heard of Bodhidharma is that he was Huike's teacher. And so they had to now come up with stories about Bodhidharma because he must have been a really good teacher because he was Huike's teacher. Today, we don't know, we never hear anything about old Huike except that he cut off his arm when he was standing in the snow, and it's really kind of sad. And then he probably had no successor, really. They patched in Kanchi Sosan or Senkan as a patch. There's no indication that he was connected to anybody. But then the real story really gets going with Doshin and Konin in Japanese in the 6th century, 6th and 7th, at the East Mountain teachings. Because this is when it really, this is real. We do come from those people, and they were probably primarily meditation teachers, and renowned meditation teachers, and a lot of what Zen is started there, really. And so that's something that I think it's good to know. So it's so I was not personally ever the least bit disheartened at learning that some story was not literally true. Somehow this never bothered me the least bit because the teachings are true. If you're with them long enough, you realize, you see it, you feel and see, and there's no words that actually describe this. You realize for yourself that this is true. This is real. And so you don't need the myths. The myths are fun, but you don't really need them to prove anything.
Did you have as you were doing your research and compiling what stands out as like things where you just thought like, wow, it's incredible. I'd never really thought about it that way, or aspects of Buddhist philosophy or history that you'd never really encountered? Are there any things that really kind of like stood out to you as being shocking or interesting?
Well, I think one thing that I think, this goes back to the myths. We tend to make a big deal out of Hui Ning, the 6th patriarch, and he may have been a slow guy for all we know. But of course, the Platform Sutra is really a work of fan fiction. It was written several years after he died, and by people probably who didn't know him, and some parts that we know couldn't have happened, like the poetry contest story, which is a great story, but the historians have been able to figure out that Hui Ning and the revered senior student, who was the other guy in the story, his name was Shunju, they were not there at the East Mountain Temple at the same time. So, you know, so it didn't happen. So we don't really know anything about Hui Ning. But the real, I came to realize that, if Zen had any one guy that we would all go back to and point fingers at and say, this is the guy that made Zen Zen, I would say that it's Matsu. Matsu Daoyi. He lived in 709 to 788. And he's the one who came up with the phrase, you know, ordinary mind is the way. And mind is Buddha. And also mind is not Buddha, just because he's contrary, because that's what Zen people are. He was so much of what I think how Zen happened, but its flavors, its methodologies, how it just its approach to Dharma. I think so much of it, I think, comes from Matsu. I don't think we really appreciate that as much as we probably could. And then you get to see the, you know, getting to know the teachers, learning about them, how they related to each other as time went on. It was really, really an interesting and rewarding exercise for me.
Did as you were going through the kind of the Japanese history, did you notice? Are you able to parse out? You know, so a lot of the Zen we practice in this country is of Japanese origin,
right?
And sometimes it's not always clear to a casual onlooker what is Japanese and what is Zen. Do you have any insight into that differentiation from your studies?
Well, you know, I think a lot of the connection to the arts, when, you know, this is something Daido was big on, where people should know something about paintbrush painting and about even flower arrangement, writing poetry, and that connection to the arts. That's actually China. That's very Japanese. I think that there was always part of Zen going back into China, but it's something that came to be more emphasized in Japan, I think, than it had been in China. So that's kind of a Japanese thing. Although there's a lot of things that people think they know about Zen that aren't true. I mean, the whole business with the martial arts, especially in Japan, I came to realize is really overemphasized and over-romanticized and overhyped and overblown, and it really wasn't nearly as big a thing in Japanese Buddhism as we might want to think. And also going back into China, that so many people say, oh, well, Zen happened because Buddhism got mixed into Taoism, and they went together and that made Zen. Not really. That's not exactly what happened. There certainly is a lot of influence of Taoism and also Confucianism in Chinese Buddhism, all of Chinese Buddhism. But there really was never a moment that Zen and Taoism were marching hand in hand. There's no historic connection to the Zen school or Chan school that doesn't apply to all the other schools. So that really didn't happen. I think it's a lot of it is that the people see Taoism in it because it's of the modes of expression. They borrowed a lot of Taoist modes of expression, but they also borrowed a lot of Confucian modes of expression to express the Dharma. But they didn't always mean the same things by it.
Right.
You need to keep it straight that Taoism is, well, especially religious Taoism, is actually quite a bit different from Mahayana Buddhism. And you don't want to keep them. If you're trying to learn about Zen through a Taoist filter, you're going to miss a lot of it. And probably if you were trying to learn about Taoism from a Zen filter, you're going to miss a lot of it. So you need to appreciate each one as what it is in itself. But Japan, I think that the Japanese influence is probably more you see more of it in the Rinzai school, I think, than in Soto. Rinzai really went through a lot of evolving in Japan. So it ended up being quite a bit different from the Linji school in China and elsewhere, particularly in its approach, how it approaches koan contemplation. Whereas in Rinzai, you go through this curriculum of many koans, and Chan and Linji in China, you get one, and you just work with that one. Maybe, so that's a big difference in approach. And I think that Rinzai in Japan seems to have become a bit sort of a bit more macho, maybe, than it had been in China. Whereas Soto, also, of course, it was not exactly what it had been in China either. Dogen was really wanted. He was a stickler for doing everything the way it had been done in China. That's what he wanted. But then, as time went on, of course, eventually he died, and other teachers came along, and it did change and evolve, but I don't think nearly as much. So there's that too.
What other? So I know you. I think we know each other through posting on the Zen groups on Facebook, and I've seen you be pretty skillful at pointing out common misconceptions people have about Buddhist philosophy. What would you say are some of the most common or most egregious misunderstandings people have about just basic Buddhist and Zen philosophy, if you can think of anything?
Well, I think that the one you run into all the time is that people saying, "Oh, you don't really have to work at this stuff. You're just going out and being generally excellent somehow. We're just going to go listen to the breeze and the trees and the waterfall and what nature will teach us." And Alan Watts was real big at starting a lot of that. When in truth, there's that great story, the Layman Pong story about whether Zen was difficult or easy. And of course it is difficult and it is also easy at the same time. It's easy because you're simply returning to original self, original reality. But the problem is that Zen may be simple, but we human beings are complicated. We're complicated. We are so complicated. There's so much level of complication in each one of us walking around. We're like a whole cosmos of complication. And that's what we practice. You can't just throw that complication stuff out and ignore it and just go off and no, you have to confront it. You have to sit with it. You have to go through it. And it's hard. It is like the hardest thing you ever did. I went through, and although at the same time it's very easy. What can I say? I know I'd been a student for a fairly short time, and I ran into it was just starting to hit me. This was at Zen Mountain Monastery, and it was starting to hit me what I was really trying to do there with this business about.
Was what? I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit.
What I was really trying to do, I was trying to, forget the self or become selfless, or I didn't know what it was they've been trying to tell me to do. And I was beginning to catch on and going, oh my gosh, I felt like I was trying to break up a glacier with a salad fork, And I mentioned this to one of the other students, and she said, "Oh, don't worry, the sun will come out and melt the glacier." And I thought, "Oh, yeah, okay." But, in a way, she was right. But if you don't, I think until you have that moment of the awesome, the, immensity of the Dharma,
Mm-hmm.
that, you can, it's easy to be breezy about it and go, "Oh, yeah, you don't have to work at this."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good luck with that, people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but again, though, I mean, it's a joyous kind of work, though. Um, when you find the right teacher, when you find the right community, it can be a very joyous thing.
Are you working with a teacher now or a community?
I am not, and this is, my personal complaint is that I am here in the Ozarks, and because of, I spent the 3 years working on the book, and then shortly after that, the COVID came along.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Everything closed down, and I would like very much to. I'm very far away. I'm physically cut off from the Sangha, and I've been very sad about that.
Mm-hmm.
So the internet is my only connection with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I would very, very much like to find another community and teacher to join,
Mm-hmm.
preferably in the Northeast, because my children and my grandchildren live in Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to see them now and then. But we'll have to see how that goes.
Right.
So that's I'm old now. I'm an old lady. I'm 70. I had some health issues. I'm not sure I could live in a monastery. I keep a monastic schedule anymore. I think it would be too physically difficult for me.
Mm-hmm.
So they would have to give me some space to not follow the schedule all the time. And I'm not sure people are always not willing to do that.
Right.
But right. So I'm not sure where I'm going to go next, but I do, one of these days, I have to take that step and find a community. It's something I really want to do,
Mm-hmm.
because I do miss connection with Sangha very much.
Well, thank you so much for your time. If someone wanted to get in touch with you, what would be the best way?
Oh, let me see. Well, I'm kind of all over Facebook. Um, that would probably be the easiest way to get hold of me. Or you could, in a pinch, you could always contact my publisher, Shambhala.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Okay.
and I do have a website, which I complain. It's not about Buddhism. I complain about contemporary issues.
Okay. If
Which is mahablog.com,
okay.
Mahablog. So you can always find me there.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank
Okay.
you so much. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.